Two elderly farmers were tied back to back and locked inside a freezing shed, left in silence by men who thought fear was enough to steal a lifetime of land. The neighbors heard the engine, saw the lights, and turned away. In this town, everyone knew the cost of speaking up. What those men didn't know was that their son, a Navy SEAL, was coming home that night with his K-9, and he doesn't ask why. He ends fear. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story moves you, subscribe for more. Late autumn pressed down on Red Willow, Montana, with a cold that arrived early and refused to leave. The sky sat low and colorless, a dull sheet of gray that flattened the surrounding hills and forests. Bare aspens rattled in the wind, their last leaves skidding across gravel roads like dry bones. At dusk, Red Willow always grew quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that came from people learning when not to look out their windows. The Cross Farm lay just beyond the town's edge, where paved roads surrendered to dirt and pine trees thickened into shadow. The farmhouse was old but cared for, white paint worn thin by decades of snow and sun. Behind it stood a weathered wooden shed, its boards darkened by age, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Walter Cross had built that shed himself when his hands were younger and steadier. Walter Cross, 78, moved slowly now, but there was nothing fragile about him. He was broad through the shoulders, his posture bent more from habit than weakness. His hands, thick, scarred, and permanently rough, had coaxed crops from stubborn soil for over 50 years. Ruth Cross, a year younger, was smaller and sharper, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, her eyes clear and observant. She spoke softly, but people who knew her understood that her calm came from strength, not submission. That evening, Ruth stood at the kitchen counter, kneading dough, while Walter latched the shutters against the coming cold. The sun was already sinking behind the tree line when the sound reached them. An engine idling too long, too close. Walter paused, his hand still on the latch. "That's not anyone we know," he said quietly. Ruth didn't answer right away. She had lived in Red Willow long enough to recognize danger by instinct alone. The silence outside felt wrong, stretched thin. The knock came hard. Once, and then the door splintered inward. 4 men forced their way inside. They wore work jackets and faded jeans, caps pulled low, boots heavy with dried mud. Their faces were familiar in the way bad news always is, recognizable but never welcome. They didn't shout. They didn't rush. They moved with practiced confidence. Red chain. The man who stepped forward first was thick-necked and square-built, his frame heavy with muscle that had long since turned blunt. A pale scar dragged one corner of his mouth downward, giving him a permanent look of contempt. He smiled as if he were visiting old friends. "Evening," he said. "We're here about the land." Walter stepped in front of Ruth without hesitation. "You don't belong here," he said. The response came fast and measured, a sharp blow to Walter's ribs. Not enough to break bone, just enough to drive the air from his lungs and fold him slightly. Ruth cried out once before a strip of silver duct tape was pressed firmly across her mouth. Another piece followed for Walter, sealing his words behind a metallic taste and the sound of his own breathing. They worked quickly. Rope bit into Walter's wrists, then Ruth's. The men forced them down, back to back, looping the rope around both bodies until movement became nearly impossible. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't sloppy, it was efficient. One of the men unfolded a packet of papers and dropped them onto the kitchen table, along with a pen. "Sign these," he said evenly. "You don't, and accidents start happening. Fires, falls, medical emergencies nobody gets to in time." Walter shook his head, a muffled sound tearing uselessly against the tape. The men didn't argue. They dragged the couple through the back door and across the yard, the cold already biting hard. The wooden shed loomed at the property's edge, its door groaning as it was yanked open. Inside, the air smelled of rust, old oil, and damp earth. They shoved Walter and Ruth onto the dirt floor. One man crouched and peeled the tape away, not out of kindness, but calculation. The door slammed shut. A padlock snapped into place. Darkness swallowed them whole. Inside the shed, the cold settled fast. The dirt floor leached warmth from their bodies. The thin walls did nothing to stop the wind, which crept in through the cracks with a low, whistling moan. Walter leaned his head back until it rested against Ruth's shoulder, feeling her breath tremble. "They'll come back," Ruth whispered. "They want us scared." Walter swallowed. "We don't sign." Time stretched, slow and merciless. Hunger crept in. So did fear. That was the point. Red Chain didn't need bruises. They needed obedience. Down the road, Ellen Pritchard, their nearest neighbor, slowed her car as unfamiliar headlights caught her eye. Ellen was in her early 60s, narrow-faced and perpetually tense, her gray hair always tucked beneath a knitted cap. She had grown up in Red Willow. She knew its rules better than most. She saw the men near the Cross farmhouse. She saw the way they moved. Her foot eased off the brake. She turned off her headlights. At home, Ellen locked her door, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark with her hands folded in her lap. In another house closer to town, someone placed an anonymous call to the local police line. Just a voice, no name, describing strange men and a disturbance. The phone rang. It rang again. No patrol car ever came. By full nightfall, Red Willow had returned to its familiar silence. Miles away, a pickup truck rolled west along the highway, headlights cutting through low fog. Inside sat Ethan Cross, 28, lean and controlled, his movements economical, even at rest. His hair was cropped short in a way that never quite passed for civilian, his face clean-shaven, his expression calm but alert. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket, sturdy boots. But there was nothing casual about the way his eyes scanned the road. In the back seat, a German shepherd lay with his head up, ears twitching at every shift in sound. The dog was powerful, his coat a deep black and tan, his posture relaxed only in appearance. He was trained, disciplined, and attuned to Ethan's smallest cues. Ethan hadn't told his parents he was coming. The leave was short. He wanted the surprise. When he turned off the highway onto the familiar gravel road, the truck slowed. The fog thickened, pressing close. The dog lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The Cross farm appeared through the haze, and something immediately felt wrong. The gate stood open, hanging crooked on one hinge. The house was dark, no porch light, no window glow. The German shepherd released a low, controlled growl. Ethan shut off the engine and stepped out, boots crunching softly on gravel. He didn't rush. He didn't call out. He moved with deliberate caution, scanning the yard, the tree line, the silhouette of the shed in the distance. At the front door, he saw the damage. Fresh splintering near the lock, wood torn inward. He crouched, fingers brushing the ground. There, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves, was a drag mark, shallow but unmistakable, leading away from the house. Toward the shed. The wind pushed through the trees, carrying the scent of rust and old wood. The German shepherd's body angled forward, muscles tightening, eyes fixed on the same point. Something cold and familiar settled into Ethan's chest. The quiet of Red Willow pressed in around them, heavy and unbroken. Ethan followed the mark with his eyes, then took a single step forward. The lock on the shed gave way with a dull crack. The wooden door groaned as Ethan forced it open, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind threading through the trees. Cold air rushed inside, carrying with it the smell of rust and damp soil. "Mom, Dad." His voice stayed low, steady. No panic, no wasted sound. Walter and Ruth were exactly where the darkness had hidden them. collapsed back to back on the dirt floor, rope biting deep into their wrists and shoulders. Their breathing was shallow but present, ragged with cold. Ruth lifted her head at the sound of his voice, disbelief flickering across her face before relief softened it. Ethan moved fast, controlled. He dropped to one knee, knife already in hand. The blade slid cleanly through the rope with 2 precise cuts. He supported their weight as the tension released, easing them apart so they didn't fall. "Easy," he said quietly. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't swear. His hands were already working. Fingers at his father's neck, counting the rhythm of a pulse, then at Ruth's wrist. Strong enough, cold, but stable. He brushed the backs of his fingers along their cheeks, checking temperature, then scanned quickly for injuries. A darkening bruise bloomed along Walter's ribs. Ruth's wrists were raw, skin abraded, but intact. Ethan pulled his jacket off and wrapped it around his mother's shoulders, then shrugged out of the thermal layer beneath and pressed it into his father's hands. "Keep it on," he said. "Both of you." Only when he was satisfied they were breathing evenly did he let himself meet their eyes. Ruth reached up, her hand trembling as it touched his cheek. "You weren't supposed to come today," she whispered. "I know." Walter swallowed, his jaw tight. They knew our schedule. When we eat, when we lock up, when the lights go out. Ethan's eyes sharpened. "How many?" "4, Walter said. "1 talked too much. The rest watched. They weren't guessing, son. They were sure." "They had papers," Ruth added. "Names, numbers. The land boundaries were already marked." Ethan nodded once, absorbing every word. There was no shock on his face, only the quiet focus of someone cataloging facts that mattered. The German shepherd stood at the shed entrance, body angled outward, ears rotating with each sound from the surrounding woods. He did not step inside. He watched. Ethan helped his parents to their feet and guided them toward the house, slow and careful. Inside, he set them near the fireplace, building a small fire with efficient movements, then brought water and blankets. Only when the color began to return to Ruth's face did he allow himself to sit across from them. A knock sounded at the back door. The shepherd stiffened instantly. Ethan was on his feet before the second knock came, one hand raised in a silent command. He moved to the door, opened it a fraction. A woman stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy parka. She was in her mid-30s, average height, with dark hair pulled into a practical knot. Her face was pale, eyes sharp and tired, as if sleep had been rationed rather than lost. She carried a medical bag clutched close to her chest. "My name is Martha Hale," she said softly. "I'm a nurse. I live 2 roads over." Ethan studied her for a beat, then opened the door fully. Martha stepped inside, her gaze flicking briefly to the shepherd before settling on Walter and Ruth. Her movements were calm, practiced. She knelt in front of Ruth first, checking her wrists, her pupils, asking questions in a gentle, measured tone. "You're not the first," Martha said quietly as she worked. "You're the first who got help this fast." Ruth looked up. "How many?" "At least 7 households," Martha replied. "All older, all alone. Some signed, some didn't." "And the ones who didn't?" Walter asked. Martha hesitated just long enough to be honest. "1 couple, out past Miller Creek. They vanished after refusing. House sold 2 months later, under a shell name." The fire cracked softly. Ethan didn't speak, but something hardened behind his eyes. Martha finished bandaging Ruth's wrists and stood, meeting Ethan's gaze. "They watch who talks. That's why I came after dark." Another knock, sharper this time. The shepherd growled, low and warning. A young man stood in the doorway when Ethan opened it. He was tall and thin, early 30s at most, with a narrow face and earnest eyes that didn't quite know where to rest. His uniform jacket looked new, too new for a town like Red Willow. His posture was stiff, as if he were still learning how to wear authority. "Deputy Nolan Pierce," he said quietly. "I wasn't on duty." Ethan didn't invite him in immediately. Nolan swallowed. "I heard something was wrong here, and I didn't hear it from dispatch." That was answer enough. Inside, Nolan removed his hat, his fingers worrying the brim. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just needed to say this to someone who'd listen." He glanced toward the windows before continuing. "Complaints go missing, files get altered, calls disappear from the log. I've seen it." Walter's mouth tightened. "Who?" Nolan's jaw flexed. "Sheriff Caleb Morton." The name landed heavy in the room. Nolan went on, voice low. "He's been here 20 years. Big man, big smile. He has arrangements. Red Chain does enforcement. Morton looks the other way. Sometimes more than that." Martha crossed her arms. "You're sure?" Nolan nodded once. "I saw a transfer, cash, logged as evidence intake. It vanished the next day." Silence followed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the house. Ethan stood slowly. He walked to his mother and rested a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not calling the local police," he said. Ruth looked up at him. "I know." He turned to Nolan. "You shouldn't have come." Nolan met his gaze, fear and resolve warring in his expression. "I know." Ethan nodded. "Then go, and don't come back here tonight." Nolan didn't argue. He replaced his hat and left, his shoulders hunched, as if bracing against more than the cold. Martha gathered her bag. "I'll check on you tomorrow," she said to Ruth, quietly. Ethan walked her to the door. "Thank you." She hesitated. "Be careful," she said, then disappeared into the dark. The house grew still again. Ethan returned to his parents. He knelt in front of Ruth, taking her hands in his. "I'll end this," he said, voice calm, absolute. "Not just for us." Ruth squeezed his fingers, eyes shining with something close to pride. Outside, the shepherd resumed his watch, silent and unmoving, as Red Willow slept uneasily under the weight of truths it had buried too long. Night settled over Red Willow like a held breath. The cold deepened after sunset, seeping into the ground and sharpening every sound. Frost glimmered faintly on the edges of leaves and fence posts, and the moon hid behind thin clouds, offering just enough light to turn shadows into moving shapes. Ethan moved through it without hurry. He wore plain clothes, dark jacket, worn boots, nothing that marked him as military. There was no insignia, no weapon drawn from a government armory. He carried only what any civilian could, relying on habits burned into muscle memory rather than equipment. Each step was placed with care. Each pause had purpose. The German shepherd moved ahead of him, low and silent, a living extension of Ethan's awareness. The dog's coat blended with the night, black and tan breaking into shadow. His ears shifted constantly, mapping the unseen. They skirted the edge of town, keeping to tree lines and fence rows. Ethan never crossed open ground without stopping first, never lingered where light spilled from a window. He watched patterns. When porch lights flicked off, when engines passed, when the town seemed most asleep. Red Willow wasn't empty. It was restrained. The river marked the town's western boundary, slow and dark, its surface reflecting slivers of moonlight. Beyond it stood an abandoned lumber mill, its skeletal frame looming against the trees. Once it had been the town's heartbeat. Now it was rot and rust, officially condemned, unofficially avoided. The shepherd stopped. His body stiffened, nose lifting as the wind shifted. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply turned his head toward the mill and held it there. Ethan followed his gaze. The mill wasn't as abandoned as it claimed to be. A single light burned inside, dim, shielded, but steady. Tire tracks cut fresh lines through the dirt near the loading bay. Someone had cleared fallen branches from the access road. Recently. Ethan crouched, scanning the perimeter. No guards posted openly. That meant confidence, or corruption. They circled wide, staying downwind. The shepherd led him to a narrow gap between stacked lumber and a collapsed fence. From there, Ethan could see more. Men moved inside, silhouettes passing behind warped planks. A generator hummed softly. This wasn't a meeting spot. It was a base. Earlier that evening, Ethan had walked the town under a different kind of cover. He'd visited places people didn't expect trouble to find them. An aging gas station, a diner that closed too early, a feed store that survived on loyalty more than profit. At the diner, an older man sat alone at the counter, shoulders hunched beneath a threadbare jacket. His name was Frank Morrow, though Ethan learned that only after ordering coffee and waiting. Frank's hand shook slightly as he stirred sugar into his cup, eyes fixed on the door. "They take a cut," Frank said at last, voice barely above the clink of ceramic. "Every month." Ethan didn't prompt him. "Red chain," Frank continued. "Call it protection. Call it whatever you want. You don't pay, something breaks. A fence, a truck, sometimes worse." Frank glanced around before leaning closer. "The sheriff knows." Ethan had nodded once and paid for both coffees. At the feed store, a woman in her 50s with a weathered face and steel-gray hair. Linda Perez had spoken faster, anger bleeding through her fear. She owned land near the creek, land she'd inherited from her father. "They came with papers already filled out," she said. "All I had to do was sign. When I said no, the next week my barn burned." Her eyes hardened. "Fire marshal said it was faulty wiring. Funny thing, I rewired it myself." She didn't need to say more. Word spread slowly, cautiously. Always in fragments. Always with glances over shoulders. Red Willow had learned to survive by speaking in half-truths. Deputy Nolan Pierce moved through his own quiet work that night. Alone in the small records room of the sheriff's office, he sat hunched over a computer terminal, uniform jacket draped over the back of his chair. His face looked paler under fluorescent light, his jaw clenched tight. Nolan was methodical. He didn't rush. He copied traffic camera footage first, then logs. He noticed patterns others had missed, or chosen not to see. Cameras near the mill went offline every night between midnight and 3. The same window, every time. He inserted a flash drive and began duplicating files. Reports of vandalism rerouted, assault calls downgraded, names altered, dates shifted. The edits weren't sloppy. They were practiced. He swallowed and kept going. Back by the river, Ethan and the shepherd edged closer to the mill. A side door hung slightly ajar, its lock broken but left in place for appearances. Inside, the smell hit, first, oil, sawdust, stale sweat. They didn't enter. Instead, Ethan watched. He counted vehicles. He listened. He noted who came and went and how long they stayed. The shepherd led him to a drainage culvert near the foundation. Inside, hidden behind loose boards, was a metal box. Ethan eased it open. Cash. Bundled, unmarked, thick with the smell of grease and wood. Beneath it lay a clipboard wrapped in plastic. Pages of handwritten notes stared back at him. Addresses, parcel numbers, dates. Land. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an oilcloth, were weapons. Not military grade, but illegal all the same. Sawed-off barrels, unregistered handguns. Ethan closed the box and slid it back into place. This wasn't intimidation. It was infrastructure. The shepherd's ears twitched again. Headlights swept briefly across the trees, then vanished. Ethan melted into shadow until the sound faded. Hours later, when the town slept its deepest, Ethan returned to the farm. He washed his hands at the sink, the water running cold and clear. He dried them slowly. Walter sat at the table, wrapped in a blanket, eyes following his son. Ruth rested nearby, her breathing steady. "They're organized," Ethan said simply, "and they're protected." Walter nodded, as if he'd known all along. Outside, the shepherd lay near the door, alert even in rest. Red Willow's silence held, but it no longer felt empty. It felt exposed. The river carried the sound first, a low mechanical hum drifting across the water, steady and deliberate. It blended easily with the night, easy to miss if you weren't listening for it. Inside the abandoned lumber mill, floodlights flickered on one by one, casting hard yellow pools across warped concrete and rusted machinery. A pickup rolled through the loading bay and stopped near the center of the mill. Two figures were forced out. They were an elderly couple, bound together at the wrists with plastic ties. The man's shoulders sagged beneath a heavy coat, several sizes too big, his gray hair plastered flat by sweat. His wife was thinner, her frame almost swallowed by a threadbare scarf and an old wool sweater. Her eyes darted constantly, sharp with fear, but unbroken. They were the Harrisons, longtime residents of Red Willow, owners of a narrow strip of riverfront land that Red Chain had been circling for months. The men who escorted them moved with practiced indifference. One of them, tall, lean, with a patchy beard and restless eyes, kept glancing toward the river as if measuring time. Another, broader and slower, carried a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Same routine," the bearded man muttered. "Talk first. If they stall, we scare 'em. We don't need another mess." The Harrisons were shoved onto a pair of overturned crates near the old saw line. A single chair was dragged forward and set deliberately between them and the others, close enough to feel intimate, far enough to remind them who controlled the space. Outside the mill, the forest held its breath. Ethan lay prone behind a collapsed stack of lumber, the rough wood pressing into his forearms. He had already counted 6 men inside, 2 armed, 1 watching the river, the rest distracted by confidence. His breathing stayed slow, controlled. Beside him, the German shepherd flattened instinctively, muscles coiled beneath his coat. The dog's eyes never left the loading bay. Ethan waited. He didn't rush. He never rushed. The priority was clear. The Harrisons came out alive. Inside the mill, the bearded man stepped forward, crouching in front of the couple. "You know why you're here?" he said conversationally. "We've been patient. You haven't." The Harrison woman lifted her chin. "We're not selling." The man smiled, thin and humorless. He reached down and snapped his fingers. One of the others kicked a metal barrel, sending it clanging loudly across the floor. The echo boomed through the empty space. Fear did its work. That was the moment Ethan moved. He slipped around the mill's outer wall, staying low, using shadow and broken machinery as cover. The shepherd ghosted ahead, silent as a thought. When they reached the rear exit, Ethan paused, listening. The dog's ears angled sharply to the right. Footsteps. 1 guard, pacing. Ethan waited until the man turned away, then tapped the shepherd once behind the shoulder. The dog surged forward, low and fast. The guard barely had time to gasp before a powerful body hit him from the side, knocking him into a pile of scrap. The shepherd pinned him expertly, jaws locked on the man's forearm just hard enough to immobilize without tearing. The guard screamed once. It was cut short by Ethan's hand, clamping over his mouth. "Don't move," Ethan said quietly. He secured the man and moved on. Inside, tension spiked as the shout echoed faintly. "What was that?" someone called. The bearded man straightened, hand drifting toward his waistband. At the far edge of the mill, a second armed man stepped toward the side door, straight into the shepherd's path. The dog launched, striking center mass, knocking the weapon skittering across the concrete. The man went down hard, breath punched from his lungs. Ethan was already moving. He closed the distance in seconds, using the mill's machinery as cover, striking from angles the men weren't prepared for. One was shoved into a steel support beam and dropped, stunned. Another caught a forearm to the throat and crumpled, gasping. No gunshots, no killing blows, just speed, leverage, and control. Panic spread fast. 2 men bolted for the river exit. The shepherd broke away instantly, blocking the narrow path between stacked pallets. He planted himself there, teeth bared, a living wall of muscle and intent. They skidded to a stop, hands raised, terror plain on their faces. Near the center of the mill, the bearded man backed away from the Harrisons, eyes wide now, calculating. "This isn't how it goes," he said hoarsely. "This isn't—" Ethan stepped into the light. The man froze. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He moved forward, calm and unhurried, every step a quiet promise that the fight was over. "Hands where I can see them," Ethan said. The man hesitated, then dropped to his knees. Ethan cut the ties, binding the Harrisons, and guided them toward cover. "Stay behind me," he said gently. Outside the mill, miles away, Deputy Nolan Pierce sat in his car, with his laptop open on the passenger seat. His hands shook slightly as he pressed send. The files left his computer in a silent stream. Camera logs, altered reports, timestamps, financial transfers. He watched the progress bar complete, then exhaled shakily. The reply came faster than he expected. "Warrant approved. Hold position." At the sheriff's office, Caleb Morton stared at his desk, sweat beading along his hairline. The night shift radio crackled with confused reports. Noise at the mill, men down, no shots fired. He reached for the phone, fingers clumsy, and began deleting entries from the log. Too slow. By the time he stood, the damage was already done. Back at the mill, all 6 members of Red Chain lay restrained on the floor, breathing hard, fear replacing arrogance. The Harrisons sat wrapped in Ethan's jacket, the woman gripping her husband's hand as if anchoring herself to the world. One of the men, young, barely 30, his face streaked with grime and tears, started to sob. "It wasn't my idea," he blurted. "They said it was clean, that the sheriff had our backs." Ethan crouched in front of him. "Who paid you?" The man swallowed. "Everyone, every month, cash envelopes, Morton and his deputies, 2 of them. They told us who wouldn't talk, who needed pressure. Accidents, they called it." Ethan stood slowly. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Different this time. Federal. Red Willow, for the first time in years, was awake. The morning arrived without spectacle. 2 unmarked federal vehicles rolled into Red Willow at first light, their tires whispering over asphalt, still damp with river mist. The town did not wake to sirens or shouted commands. It woke to doors opening quietly, to measured footsteps, to the soft authority of people who did not need to raise their voices. Inside the temporary command room set up at the old municipal annex, Special Agent Laura Hensley stood with her jacket draped neatly over the back of a chair. She was in her early 40s, tall with iron-gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. Her manner was calm, almost gentle, but her reputation preceded her. Methodical, relentless, uninterested in excuses. She studied the evidence laid out before her with the focus of someone who had seen too many towns hollowed out by fear. "This wasn't a gang," she said quietly. "It was a business." Across from her, Deputy Nolan Pierce sat stiffly, hands folded on the table. He looked younger than his years now, exhaustion etched beneath his eyes. But there was relief there, too. He nodded. "They kept records. Who paid? Who resisted? Who needed pressure?" Hensley glanced up. "And who looked the other way?" By noon, the truth was no longer a rumor. Members of Red Chain were taken into custody, one by one, led from homes and makeshift hideouts with hands cuffed and faces drained of bravado. Charges followed swiftly: kidnapping, unlawful confinement, coercion, conspiracy, organized criminal activity. The paper trail was airtight, the testimonies corroborated. The fear they had spread returned to them in a single, unrelenting wave. At the sheriff's office, Caleb Morton sat alone as federal agents entered. He had aged 10 years overnight. His once polished boots were scuffed, his uniform rumpled. He said nothing when they placed the warrant on his desk. He did not resist when they took his weapon. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if the wall might open and swallow him whole. 2 of his deputies followed before sunset, their faces pale with disbelief as they were led away past townspeople who watched in silence, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, solemn clarity. The truth had finally stepped into the open. Ethan Cross did not witness any of it. He stood instead at the edge of his parents' land, boots planted in soft earth, examining a length of cedar rail he planned to replace. He wore a faded jacket and work gloves, his hair unremarkable, his posture relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with carelessness and everything to do with control. The German shepherd lay nearby, head resting on crossed paws, eyes tracking every movement. The dog's presence was steady, grounding, protective without being possessive. Behind them, the farmhouse breathed again. Walter and Ruth Cross sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the early chill of late autumn settling into the valley. Walter's hands were still rough from a lifetime of work, but they no longer trembled when he held his coffee. Ruth's gaze followed her son with quiet pride. Her fear loosened at last. Martha Hale arrived just after noon, parking her old sedan beneath the maple trees. She stepped out carrying a box of medical supplies, her movements purposeful. In her mid-50s, Martha had silver threading her dark hair and a voice that soothed without effort. She had always been like that. Steady hands, steady heart. "I'm opening the center next week," she said once they were seated. "Not a clinic, a place. Somewhere people can talk before things go too far." Ruth reached for her hand. "You'll save more lives that way than you know." Across town, Nolan Pierce stood before a small gathering outside the courthouse. There were no banners, no speeches prepared in advance, just people, farmers, shopkeepers, retirees, listening as he explained what came next. Oversight committees, transparent reporting, independent review. "I won't promise perfection," Nolan said, voice clear despite the weight of the moment. "But I will promise this. No one gets ignored again." They believed him. By midweek, the media arrived. Satellite vans lined the highway. Reporters asked the same questions with different words. Who was the man at the mill? Was he military? Would he speak? Ethan declined every request. He met once with Agent Hensley in private, listened as she thanked him for restraint, for judgment, for choosing the harder path. When she mentioned commendations, he shook his head. "Do what you came to do," he said simply. "That's enough." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It usually is." When the reporters realized there would be no interview, no face for their headlines, they eventually left. Red Willow did not chase them. Weeks passed. The river ran slower. Leaves turned copper and gold. Fences were mended. Doors were left unlocked again, not out of bravado, but trust. One afternoon, Ethan stood shoulder-deep in the repair of the old wooden fence that bordered the property. He worked carefully, measuring twice, cutting once. The shepherd followed him along the line, tail low and content, occasionally pausing to scan the tree line before settling again. Walter watched from the porch, a faint smile creasing his weathered face. "You always fix things the right way," he said. Ethan glanced up. "Things last longer that way." Ruth laughed softly. "That applies to more than fences." As the sun dipped toward the hills, casting long shadows across the land, the town grew quiet. Not the quiet of fear, not the silence of doors barred and lights extinguished. It was the quiet of evening settling in, of supper cooking, of a place learning how to breathe again. Ethan leaned the last rail into place and stepped back. He wiped his hands on his jeans, then crouched to rest a palm on the shepherd's broad head. The dog looked up at him, eyes calm, unwavering. Behind them, Red Willow stood unafraid. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for something bad to happen. Fear survives in silence. It grows when good people look away, when doors stay closed, when voices stay quiet. But courage doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up as someone who refuses to accept injustice as normal. Sometimes it's a neighbor who finally speaks. Sometimes it's choosing to protect instead of retaliate, to rebuild instead of destroy. In our everyday lives, we may never face what Red Willow faced, but we all face moments where doing the right thing feels uncomfortable, risky, or lonely. This story is a reminder that standing up, calmly, lawfully, and with integrity, can change more than just one moment. It can change an entire community. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that fear should never be the final word. Comment below and tell us, what part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you believe in stories about courage, protection, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that matter. Because light doesn't erase darkness by force. It does it by showing up, again and again,